So, you think we could have the magnificent Monica sound out this beautiful document?
United Lodge of Theosophists, Declaration. The policy of this lodge is independent devotion to the cause of theosophy without professing attachment to any theosophical organization. It is loyal to the great founders of the theosophical movement, but does not concern itself with dissensions or differences of individual opinion. The work it has on hand and the end it keeps in view are too absorbing and too lofty to leave it the time or inclination to take part in side issues. That work and that end is the dissemination of the fundamental principles of the philosophy of theosophy and the exemplification in practice of those principles through a truer realization of the self, a profounder conviction of universal brotherhood. It holds that the unassailable basis for union among theosophists, wherever and however situated, is similarity of aim, purpose, and teaching, and therefore has neither constitution, bylaws, nor officers, the sole bond between its associates being that basis. And it aims to disseminate this idea among theosophists in the furtherance of unity. It regards as theosophists all who are engaged in the true service of humanity without distinction of race, creed, sex, condition, or organization, and it welcomes to its association all those who are in accord with its declared purposes and who desire to fit themselves by study and otherwise to be the better able to help and teach others. The true theosophist belongs to no cult or sect, yet belongs to each and all.
Well, thank you, Monica. Thank you so much for sounding that beautiful vibration.
Well, good afternoon, friends, and welcome to our, you could say, celebration of no less than 113 years of the United Lodge of Theosophists. So we have become a centenarian. The United Lodge was started in 1909 by Mr. Crosby and 6 more people, actually 7. I don't know if that was done on purpose or whether they didn't have any more people, but that seems to be how it evolved. So unfortunately, Mr. Crosby passed away in 1919. So he's only been among us, you could say, in ULT for about 10 years. And so, as we all know, ULT is not an organization. And in that sense, nobody can speak for ULT. So I will talk about ULT. And so what you are about to hear will be my personal opinions, because after all, that's all we got, unless you're an adept perhaps, but I'm not. And what I have to say is certainly not pointing fingers to any individual lodge or any person in particular, as I have myself been failing in every particular of the points I will try to make. And in all the time that I have been an associate of ULT, and I think I certainly haven't reached my potential there. So there are 3 subjects that I would like to bring to your attention. That is, first of all, what is a lodge? The second point is, we're talking somewhere about the lines laid down by the masters. I want to pay some attention to that. And the last one will deal with, how are we doing with the lodge? So the first part is rather short. I don't want to spend too much time on all this because I don't know how much time Jonathan needs to deal with his subject. But I think one of the mistakes that have crept in among associates for a long time, and it's understandable, that is that very often the lodge has been associated with a building. Because, yeah, we say, I'm going to the lodge. So it's sort of understandable, but I think it's important that we pay attention there to what a lodge is, because a lodge is not a building. You know that the word lodge is also used like for a chalet in the mountains, for instance, like when there's a snowstorm where you can take cover. And in a certain sense, that's also the purpose of a building. But the lodge itself is not a building. The lodge deals with ideas, not with form. And as we know, form follows function. And that relates the idea to archetypes. We're basically dealing with archetypes. And a good definition of what a lodge is would be in thinking of it as a coming together of kindred spirits or minds around a common set of ideas. In other words, a logos. So these ideas are also not necessarily identical, as we saw in the declaration, but they are similar. And you find even that same idea referred to in the Bible for people who are a little bit familiar with the New Testament in Matthew, where it's in chapter 18, verse 20, where he says, "For where 2 or 3 have gathered together in my name, I am in their midst." And that "I am in their midst" is obviously a reference to the Logos. So from that perspective, anytime people gather together and share these ideas, we have a lodge. You do not necessarily have to come to a building for that. If you have a sunny day, why not go to the park, sit in the park in a circle or under a tree and discuss those ideas? So I thought that was kind of an important point to bring that forward, and not to mistake the lodge just for a stack of bricks or concrete. So it is a coming together of kindred spirits around a common set of ideas. The second point that I would like to bring forward with regard to the lodge is that there are some references made by Crosby, also by Judge, that where they're referring to the lines laid down by the masters. And even though I've been studying theosophy for quite some time, actually just over 50 years, I finally started paying some attention to those lines laid down, because I noticed that there is no such thing as an article on the lines laid down. And so I started wondering, what are those lines laid down? Because you won't find an article, like I said, or a list of these subjects. So last night, when I was thinking about what I was going to say about this subject, I finally started paying some attention to it and contemplating the subject. And although they are not so specifically expressed, I thought I came up with a few candidates, and I'll leave it up to you if you think those are part of the lines laid down, because it is also not said how many lines have been laid down. Is it 2 or 200? We don't know. But I think usually the number 7 is a safe bet. And so I want to limit myself to 7 candidates. And I think without a doubt, the first and foremost line that was laid down by HPB, and she even made a dogma of it, even though in ULT we don't have any dogmas, and none of the branches in the movement in general should have dogmas. But don't misunderstand the dogma either. A dogma, basically, the root, the etymology of the word comes from the word teaching. A dogma is a teaching. So yeah, we have dogmas because we have teachings, but becoming dogmatic is all different ball game. So HVB says we only have one dogma, and that is universal brotherhood. And well, we all know where we can find that. It's the first object of the movement, the other two being the comparative study of religion, philosophy, and science, and the third one relates to the investigation and study of the forces that are operating in the cosmos and in ourselves. But the first one was brotherhood, a brotherly feeling for all that lives in all the kingdoms. So in that sense, I think that's a good candidate for one of the lines laid down. The second one, and everything that I sum up, you can find in one forum or another, or an article among the literature of Crosby, HPB, or Judge. The second one that I thought of in terms of importance is tolerance. And at first it sounds kind of easy, tolerance, being tolerant with one another, but it's actually very hard. And I thought of a very physical example to illustrate the difficulty there. Not to say that if you try to apply tolerance, you're walking the edge of a razor there. Because the example I want to give is about, think of an axle or a shaft that runs in a bearing. Now, in order to operate properly, if the tolerance there, that is the little area that consists or that exists between the shaft and the bearing, if that is too small, your bearing will start heating up and eventually your motor will break down. If that tolerance is too big, your shaft will start vibrating and your engine breaks down. So you actually have to get it pretty close in order to have a properly functioning engine. And therefore, if we apply that in our environment and the communication with other people, it is just as hard as getting the right tolerance for a shaft in a bearing. It's very easy to make mistakes there. The third one I thought of, which is also a very important one, is the freedom of thought. And that is that in the first place, that we have to learn to think for ourselves. Freedom of thought is also something that goes together with responsibility, and I will get to that a little bit later. So freedom of thought also includes that we learn to ask questions and also try to self-solve our questions. Maybe a bit of an odd expression, self-solving. But, you know, when we have a question and we get an answer to it from somebody else, usually we follow that up with other questions. And it very often occurs, perhaps in 90% of the cases, that a week later, we have forgotten the answer that we received to the question. Whereas if we dive within ourselves and we find the solution ourselves, then I would say for 90%, the chances are quite big that you will never forget it anymore because it came out of your own being. And that is also part of the freedom of thought, because whenever we get an answer from somebody else, there is a certain veil or limit thrown over ourselves. So freedom of thought is a very important idea that I think also makes part of the lines laid down, that nobody should be limited in their expressions. The fourth one, and also a very important one, is the non-dogmatic attitude that we need to develop. We are all dealing with concepts, ideas, and opinions. And like I said before, that's basically all we have. So what is important here in a non-dogmatic attitude is that we don't enforce our opinion on others. There's nothing wrong with having opinions. There are good opinions and there are bad opinions. But ones that we start to enforce them on others, that's where usually all the problems start. So a non-dogmatic attitude, the fourth one, I think is very important. The fifth one is the responsibility that I already referred to, and that runs in tandem with our freedom of thought. There is no freedom without, at the same time, the same level or amount of responsibility. And you could call it self-responsibility, introspection, self-correction. And there's a big difference here between responsibility and authority. Mr. Crosby, or not, HPB as well, points out that each member should be a center. So that also entails that we shouldn't be afraid to make mistakes. You know, a mistake is not a fault, you could say, unless we fail to correct it. And in that sense, introspection is a very big part of that responsibility. So I think that's also a good candidate for the lines that have been laid down. The sixth and seventh one, I'm sure you're all familiar with because it appears in the third fundamental, and that is that element of self-devised and self-induced effort. And very often those two are mentioned like in the same sentence, self-induced and self-devised efforts. And we fail to think about what the distinction is between the two. Self-induced means that we find the strength and effort for action within our own infinite potential. We, like I said, we also have to find the answers to the questions ourselves. Self-devised effort, on the other hand, is an appeal to our own higher intelligence and capacity for thinking. It's trying to evoke that infinite potential that exists within us. And our infinite potential is represented by what we refer to as the monad. Now, so that's actually basically these were the last two candidates that I wanted to bring up. I think they're all pretty good candidates. And somebody might also say, well, why don't you bring up impersonality, for instance? Isn't that one of the lines laid down? And I would say, well, yeah, you can make that a separate line laid down, but I see impersonality more as a kind of thread soul or sutratma that runs through all the lines that have been laid down. You know? So, and of course, all of the foregoing can be served with a good doses of common sense and humor, which is sometimes a little bit missing here and there among our students. So the third part is maybe a little bit critical. How are we doing? That's the third subject that I want to bring up. And at the risk of being chased out of Zoom, covered in tar and feathers, I dare to say that there is some bad news and there is some good news. And of course, these two are always relative to one another. I think we ought to ask ourselves the question, how well have we lived up to these lines laid down? Or have we only paid lip service to them, notwithstanding all the warnings and suggestions that we have in our literature? To what extent have we mistakenly exchanged responsibility for authority? ULT has no officers, but as is the case in any other structure, there's always just a few people holding the torch with a big risk of becoming self-authorities. Whereas on the other hand, sometimes we find people with a natural authority. They don't aim for authority, but they rather take responsibility. So ULT, the fact that we don't have any officers, ULT is also not an organization. We have no members, but we have associates. They associate around ideas. If we would have members, then we would have a most likely a hierarchical structure. We would have dues to pay every year, and maybe we would be able to vote. Whereas I see ULT more as an organism in which every associate is a cell that works to the best of its ability to keep that organism healthy. And we all know what happens to cells that don't cooperate with the others. It results in a kind of cancer. So in that sense, I think it's interesting to look at ULT as a kind of organism that is dependent on the input of every individual cell. Another aspect of ULT also is that ULT is not an autocracy or a plutocracy or an oligarchy, not even a democracy or any other kind of crazies. And that was pun intended, of course, as it is solely governed by karma, causes and effects. That is what runs our enthusiasm, we could say. And I would say that before about 2 years ago, notwithstanding sometimes our appearances, that ULT as a whole was sort of like a sinking Titanic while the orchestra was playing. I had the impression that very few people were actually aware or wondering of the dire situation in which we find ourselves. You know, after the 1970s, we've seen a gradual decline in attendance in ULT. There's also a bigger gap or distance that has come about between the younger generations. That gap has become bigger and bigger. We have, to some extent, failed to attract younger generations. We have insufficiently responded, I would say, to the psychology that is present among the younger generations. And often that was also due to a certain level of dogmatism. New inquirers, compared to the ones, say, before the 1950s, they were pretty much all of them pretty much came from a Christian background. Whereas nowadays, new inquirers searching for meaning have already gone through a bunch of other approaches. Think of Buddhism, Vedanta, New Age, etc. And in many cases, we have been unable to provide a proper response to these alternative approaches, especially in cyberspace. Now, the good news, however, is that over the last 2 years, not in the least, thanks to the pandemic, you see how karma works. We have been forced to start operating more permanently and intensely online, which seems to afford us a new lease on our theosophical life and some hope of redemption for possible mistakes made in the past. So, to my mind, anything that shows even a hint of unbrotherly behavior, dogmatism, intolerance, and authority will eventually lead us further down the road to perdition. Obviously, we're not implying that we have to leave our lodge buildings behind because we're going online. One thing does not necessarily exclude the other. But in view of the younger generations operating primarily online, we have to meet them where they are. And our efforts should be strengthened in that direction. So I would say, for more good news and how we may reinvigorate our efforts, I'll leave the remaining time to Jonathan. So thank you.
Thank you, Pierre, very much. I'm going to share my screen and we'll share a couple of slides, but not too many. So that was one of the things that Pierre said reminded me of this sentence from D.K. Mavalankar. Instead of looking upon himself as an isolated being, he must learn to look upon himself as part of the integral whole. Actually, all 7 of those points seem to be part of that and resonate to that. What the symbol is, I don't know. We'll talk about that later. So, no, it's supposed to be the, I guess it's an alchemical symbol, and it's supposed to actually mean the philosopher's stone. And it has to do with squaring the circle. And again, we can talk about that in the Q&A, what that means. The title, A Quintessential Ideal. First of all, Truth and I were thinking about the idea that some people have mentioned that the declaration of the United Lodge of Theosophists it's just very interesting. It's just like, it's a statement of ideals and principles and policies, but it's really a glimpse into our future evolution in some ways. So they say that the ideal is truth at a distance. So we're being called upon to live up to a very high set of standards, really. And the high set of standards have been outlined in those 7 principles that Pierre outlined for us, the lines laid down. And so I think I'm going to do a little bit of what Donson would call the via negativa and the via positiva here, as Pierre did. I think that I just wanted to go into, these are not my criticisms, but these are possible hazards of the ULT, or I guess any group, and especially any group who is trying to work for the future of humanity. And as we learned in the last 2 or 3 presentations, that really, first of all, our thinking makes it so. In other words, what we think eventually starts to happen, the self-fulfilling prophecy. And so that's the case with health, and that's the case with organizations and so forth. And so what we really want to do, as Paracelsus might say, is pay attention to the heart and the imagination. And that this is kind of the basis of Kriya Shakti, which is the idea of imagining a great future, a positive future, a healing future, an effective future, and then focusing on it, and then it unfolds like the power of any kind of a so-called magical power, which is the unfoldment of Kriya Shakti. But the opposite of that would be image crippling. And that is taking images and truncating them and turning them into something less than their full potential. So one of the things that, that I just wanted to mention here, in defense of buildings, is that, and as Pierre said, just because we're going online, that doesn't mean we're abandoning buildings. But just, I'm very much actually looking forward to in San Diego next September, when we can actually open the place. And even though the young people are most likely going to find the lodge online through these kind of presentations, as one young person explained to me, that it isn't even the live presentations that's going to grab their attention. They find these presentations when they get uploaded, you know, and they find it in those, what do you call it when there's, when you're kind of binge watching YouTube videos, and it comes in your feed. That's right. They find these presentations in their feed. So anyway, one of our little self-criticisms with the Aquarian series is that we've gotten a couple months behind. posting our presentation. So we're working on that, and hopefully within the next couple of weeks we'll get them all posted again. But where I'm going with this thing about the potency of a lodge, I think that the young people are going to actually enjoy coming to a lodge. That's just me, but we'll see. I don't know. We'll see. Because of it being an actual, people are tired of staying at home. People are tired of, this whole COVID deal. And they're tired of all these messages that they've been given that you can't live your life. So, speaking of that, one of the image crippling things that we have to be aware of, I think, is that the corporate media is true. And I am in a very good mood today. I'm feeling very much more energy than I normally do. And I was talking about this with my doctor the other day, and we were looking at the blood chart and everything like that. Oh, yes, you must be eating more, better, eating less, you're exercising more. And I says, you know what, doctor, I think it was what really happened that gave me more energy is I stopped watching the news. And that was, he got, as my first belly laugh I've really ever gotten out of a doctor before. And then he just leaned back in his chair and he went into this whole thing about, we get all this news from the media throughout the world, and it's just too overwhelming. It's just too much to take, and you're learning about all these problems that you don't have any power to do anything about. And he had explained all the biological reasons and systems of why a person actually has to manage their media intake. I think another thing that we should look out for is the idea that the Kali Yuga is overwhelming. And one of the things that Theosophy seems to make clear is that Kali Yuga is yes, it's kind of a crisis, but it's also an amazing opportunity. There's so much good that can actually be done in the Kali Yuga. And I think that this idea that the Kali Yuga is overwhelming comes from, it is tied in with this idea that the corporate media is true. Another thing would be that we could look out for would be a certain amount of reticence in relation to things that we don't really know about. We do speak of masters and Judge, and HPB, Judge, and Crosby talk about how important it is to think about them. This is a very mystical thing. But we need to be careful that we don't project our own personal ego onto what they might be like. And so a certain amount of purification and carefulness and care needs to be exercised in terms of just how we think of masters. And probably another error that we can make is that the masters are out of relation to the ULT. And the degree to which the ULT is a group of hearts and minds, as Pierre said. It's not a building, it's not this, it's not a website, it's not books. But it's an association of people associated around what? Other people? No, around ideas. And around these ideas that Pierre laid out, and around the principles and the practices that are outlined in the Declaration. And Judge points out in many places that the lodges that do the best, well, he says branches, right, are the ones that keep in mind in their hearts and in their background of thinking that not only do the masters exist, but that they are constantly working. They are constantly active. They work on their own planes, and in relation to humanity at all times. They are behind the lands, behind everything stands the lodge, says Crosby. Something very similar to that. And so the point is that we're not alone, and that the ULT can be, at its best, can be like a lens, actually, And it can be a reflection on our plane of the spiritual reality that we call the Brotherhood of Adepts. In other words, the degree to which we actually have a feeling, as Pierre mentioned, of unity, of solidarity, of, as Judge says in one place, of actual love for one another. That creates a field, and that is like a lens, and it can reflect a higher reality into a world that desperately needs the unitary, brotherly, compassionate heart tonality that the Brotherhood represents. I have a little thing that I want to bring up, and this has to do with, I would say this is the elephant in the living room of the ULT. And every person has to handle this 1975 question in their own way, even in 2022. Because the 1975 equation, I would guess, and I think that the theosophical anthropologists will say this in 300 years from now, that it was the most strong in the culture and the DNA of the ULT out of any of the organizations. Now, I could be totally wrong about that, because in some organizations, they have kind of, I would call it a great man theory. It's just that there's all kinds of great speakers and thinkers, and HPB was one of them, and it's all good. And according to the freedom of thought idea, everybody kind of takes from each whatever that they have to offer. Other organizations theosophically have had this idea of successorship. HPB, ULT doesn't go along with that one. But I would say that in the DNA of the beginning foundational thinking of the ULT, that 1975 was a big deal. I would even go so far as to mention that maybe one of the attachments to buildings, perhaps, isn't just that we're materialists and that we like things that are square, but is that these buildings, a lot of them were built in anticipation of 1975, et cetera. And I think that a lot of that was concretized. However, it would be a mistake to say that 1975 didn't happen. It would be a mistake to say that they weren't serious. I think it's a mistake to say, oh, well, we shouldn't take that literally. Because I think that would be to say that the masters are bad at math, and that they're bad at doing what they say they're going to do. And either one of those things is probably not true from what we understand about how they are. And also, I think that there's evidence that that there was an incredible time in the 70s, as Pierre referred to. And because I've talked to people in the Point Loma group, and they said that it was an incredible time for them in Europe. I've talked to, I've heard prominent people in the Theosophical Society. One particular person who was in the 70s doing community gardens. And then there was this incredible enthusiasm in the air at the time. And the kids were going to each other's houses and studying theosophy, and then going out and doing community gardens. It just seemed that there was quite a esprit de corps that was going on. Most people will tell you that the New York Lodge was an incredible place in the 70s. There were incredible beings there, and the young people were on fire, and that even now you run into one of the diaspora people of New York Lodge, and it's just a happy time for them, people working together. LA Lodge had an incredible magazine, Manus Magazine, that was produced mainly by one person, but it is also produced in a whole field of people working together in a way. Santa Barbara was just on fire at the time. Books and people and aspiration and amazing things. And so none of these things are proofs of anything, but it seems to be perhaps the hazard of image crippling to say that there was no such thing. And to me, it's part of the, a person needs to be open-ended, a person needs to be agnostic, and nobody can be dogmatic about these things. To make another person feel another way than what they already feel about these kind of things, that's dogmatism. And the main thing is that we have a lot of tolerance in the way of having the right amount of distance in that bearing, so that there can be movement and learning and growth and motion. The bearing that Pierre had mentioned. There is the idea that another image crippling boo-boo that we can make is that diversity is threatening. I think we have enough sense to know that racial diversity is not a problem, and that is to be welcomed, and that we could do better in the racial diversity department. I think, though, however, it'll be diversity of thought. It's going to be a cascade. If we want racial diversity, first of all, we want young people to come in. So it's kind of like a cascade. If we have diversity of thought and diversity of opinion, and diversity of rays of the one light, so to speak, then we'll attract young people magnetically. If we attract young people, then we'll attract diversity of different kinds of racial diversity. So that's just something to think about. Here's an idea: harmony has to be forced. Nobody thinks that, but what I want to talk about is the idea that harmony is something that is a law in nature. It is a law of laws. It is karma itself. We don't have to precipitate karma. There is a quotation from Judge in the Aquarian Almanac that's really from Letters That Have Helped Me. It says, harmony comes from a balancing of diversities and discord from any effort to make harmony by force. So harmony is something that's really about balancing existing forces that are already in place. And so that's connected to diversity is threatening. Harmony, you can't have harmony without diversity, right? How would you have a piece of music or an orchestral score or anything without diversity of tonality and the chord progressions and the repeating progressions without diversity? And it's all timing, and it's all aesthetics, and it's all balance. But it's never denying a diverse point of view, it would seem. The worst thing that we can ever do is think to ourselves that the ends justify the means. And this one might actually be summing up in a bad way all of the other ones that we mentioned here. And so it's kind of the basis of Gandhian thought, with the idea, because he was very, very strong on this and very scrupulous about this, about whenever he was about to do something, he would very much think it through, whether or not the ends are, that the means are in alignment with the ends. Because if they're not going to take us to where we thought that they were going to take us. That's one shortcoming. Another shortcoming is that there's inherent violence or himsa built into the equation whenever we make the mistake that the ends justify the means. So I just will go through a few more slides here. I wrote via positiva here. This is what I'm saying that we can do to prepare ourselves to be a part of a nucleus of universal brotherhood, which is in turn a dedicated body of students of theosophy united in similarity of aim, purpose, and teaching. We must first return to our own spiritual roots and our own golden moments, which are, in Maslowian terms, peak experiences. These need to be kept in mind at all times, if possible, because when we are saturated in our own golden moments, in other words, how did I find theosophy? Was it in a library? Was it through a special person? I know one man that walked into a lodge, and the person there turned out to be, I guess, the so-called one of the more leading people there. He greeted the person and he says, "How did you like the meeting?" "Oh yeah, it was okay. Yeah. Well, welcome. You will be coming back, and you've got a lot of work. You've got work to do." Right away, that person was told that you matter. Isn't that amazing? Talk about welcoming young people to the whole theosophical life. And I just might want to mention that is that my observation with young people is that they like to be given something to do. They want something to do. And they want to feel like they have a place right off the bat. And that's what this man did for this young man. And this person kept on studying theosophy for decades after that. So that's a powerful thing. What a beautiful intuition that both of those human beings had at that moment. These are golden moments. Another person told me that they found theosophy. Several people have told me that they found theosophy by reading the key to theosophy. So this is not so much through people, except for through the person directly who wrote the key to theosophy, right? HPV. And the idea of individuality versus personality was just like knock their socks off. It's like, this is the truth. So these are things that we can keep in mind and keep in our minds and hearts. And these are the things I think that will make lodges and human beings as nuclei of universal brotherhood, where we all radius centers of theosophy and universal brotherhood in and of ourselves, and whether we gather in my name. That's so beautiful what Pierre said about wherever students gather in my name, there's a lodge because there's a logos. That's just what a thought to be thinking about for many decades. Oh, that's the next one. We must become in and of ourselves nothing less than centers of unconditional friendship and universal fellowship. And we need to learn to listen to our own voice and to listen to and to begin to learn how to obey the Ishvara within. This is what's going to make a person a sustained student of this philosophy, because they're starting to put this philosophy into practice. And this has to do with embracing a path, a progression of questions and a progression of decisions and choices, and a progression of vows, perhaps. So all of this becomes a path of spiritual regeneration, spiritual renewal, all in the service of humanity. And thinking about this more with such a consecrated and noble resolve, higher forces and energies will be as surely attracted to us as we will in turn be the better able to transmit those higher forces and energies. Yeah, and here's that expression, where two or three are gathered in the service of the masters of wisdom or of the logos. Same thing. Now, here's some possible boo-boos. All right, via negativa. Okay, so being efficient and harmonious participants in a larger altruistic work requires the ability to cancel the personal ego. That may seem impossible, But in the Mahachohan's letter, he says that straight up, that's what we got to do. So we all have to do that in our own ways, and we can't be judgmental about other people about it. Because if we're being judgmental, then what are we doing to cancel our own personal ego? We have to get in the habit of actually letting go of every ill feeling and every prejudgment of others. We have to relinquish all weapons of offense and defense, just like in the light and the path, right? In regard to the personal self. And we have, another light in the path thing, we have to have a willingness to appear as nothing in the eyes of men. Given that adeptship and self-mastery is ultimately presented in theosophy as a directionality and a goal, one of their superpowers, so to speak, is that they've learned to do what? To appear as nothing in the eyes of men. That's a remarkable thing. It's the opposite of saying I'm dispensable and nobody recognizes my genius. Okay, so, and also in a spirit of trust and understanding, we have to become capable of giving and taking suggestions and specific requests. So that's another aspect. It's okay to give suggestions too to other people. And that's part of the mutual camaraderie of being brothers and sisters, of members of a family, you could say, in a nucleus of universal brotherhood. But also taking suggestions too. Also, the ability to function in a role, whatever that role might be. And it's usually not because a person thinks that they're the most suited for the role. Check me out, I can do this. It's more that they don't see anybody else actually doing the role, and somebody better do it, and I'll do it until somebody better comes along. And whether or not somebody better comes along, then that's up to karma, right? Meanwhile, we learn to do it crisply, cleanly, in a timely fashion, with energy and precision and detachment. And this is the cheerful dispatching of a duty, if we are asked. So let me see here. I've got another one here. Oh, I'll just mention our favorite mango in the Voice of the Silence, the magnanimous one. And the magnanimous mango within is as soft and sweet as its bright golden pulp for others as well as hard as that fruit stone for thine own throes and sorrows. And this doesn't mean that we're in some kind of a medieval psychological version of self-flogging or wearing hair shirts and just really, really hard on ourselves. Because that in its own way is kind of an expansion of the ego, which takes more effort to undo. It means really that we're taking responsibility. And that was definitely one of the 7 lines laid down in my co-speaker's presentation. So this means that while we are engaged meaningfully with the whole, we never abandon a sense of total self-responsibility. So in other words, yes, we're working with the whole, but we never forget how much one is contributing to the whole. So in other words, we don't blame other people if things go wrong. Oh, well, I was just doing what the group said. No, we have to be responsible. We have to think for ourselves. We have to ask our own questions. This has to do with also not transferring blame to anyone or anyone outside of ourselves. So-and-so made me do it. Or more likely, I have this shortcoming because of some kind of limitation that somebody else placed on me. I'm a victim. In a spirit of detachment, self-discipline, charity, and compassion, there's this ideal way to think of oneself in this noble conception of the army of the voice. And like any soldier in any army, there would be certain excellences that and signatures of valor and honesty and that which is true. And even if we consider ourselves just a humble private, we can fit into a larger whole, which was that first sentence that Damodar K. Mavalankar was talking about. I'll go back to it actually. But instead of looking at ourselves as an isolated being, we can learn to look upon, okay, he must learn to look upon himself as part of the integral whole. And we hope that that is some food for thought. And I will take my screen share off, and Pierre will answer all the questions.
Before we get there, Jonathan, I would like to bring up a diagram. It's a little bit funny at the same time, but it's kind of a psychological approach with regard to people who try to make progress in their study. I don't know if any one of you is familiar with the Dunning-Kruger effect in study.
Why don't you pull it up?
I'll pull it up here. Let's see. Just a second. And here it is. Can everybody see that? Can you see the Dunning-Kruger effect here? The picture?
It's got illusion and delusion built into it somehow.
Yeah, well, the idea here is that we have a vertical timeline. Can everybody see it?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. We have a vertical line here. That is the degree of confidence that we acquire in our study. The horizontal line here is the increase in knowledge in the field that we're studying, which is at the same time, of course, a timeline. And we see that for people that get in touch, if we apply to Theosophy, for instance, we see that people who get in touch with Theosophy at first here in the left bottom corner there, that's like that, huh? What is this, you know? And then depending, of course, on what effort we make and the level of intelligence that we have, if we look over a timeline of say 1 to 5 years, there is actually a relatively rapid increase of what Theosophy has to offer. And I noticed that most of the answers that we're looking for in Theosophy happen within that time frame. You know, there is a rapid satisfaction of our superficial questions. And that leads us to the top point there at the very top, where we very often take the position, I know everything about Theosophy, you know, which is at the same time that point where we reach our level of dogmatism. Because if we do not make any further efforts there, you can draw that line horizontally in time too, and we just remain at the same level of insight and try to protect that. Anything that attacks that level, we have a dogmatic approach there. But anybody who starts to really push the boundaries, the timeline goes further here, and we dive into our subject, and then we figure out that there's more to this than I thought, you know? And if we keep pushing the boundary, we may even come to a kind of frustrating moment of, I'm never going to understand this. That's this level here. But if you keep pushing, then over time you come to a point where you say, okay, maybe it starts to make sense, you know, to eventually, when you really make a deep dive, you come to the point where you say, trust me, it's complicated, you know. And of course, beyond that, you probably end up in a kind of a vacuum of oblivion or so, because I noticed for myself that the further that we study, there is this rapid increase in receiving answers to our questions. But as time moves on, the answers become less and less, and we are thrown more and more into the ideas behind what we're looking for than in actual answers that we receive. And that goes together with that idea of self-induced and self-devised efforts. We are the ones who have to figure it out. One of the Mahatmas says, the Mahatma is not made, he becomes. And that, which is obviously an indication that we have to do the work ourselves. And the longer we are involved with Theosophy, it seems at least the fewer answers we get, but we have to evolve them ourselves. So I thought it was kind of an interesting and kind of funny graphic that represents the psychology of study. So, all right.
Thank you.
All right, so let's start with the questions for Jonathan and myself. Anybody? Go ahead.
Oh, it's Judy. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay,
I'll
let's
wait.
start with Judy. All right, Judy.
Oh, all right. Thank you both for very wonderful presentations. They're very insightful. And what I've been wondering about is how we really teach the young by finding where they are today. I mean, I've been a teacher at Cal Poly since 1975, and now I have young people taking care of me, some of whom are interested in Theosophy, who have rings in their nose and tattoos, and no one is getting married anymore. They think very differently than we do. And I had one of them tell me, well, I just don't like church. And I said, it's not a church. We're not going to tell you what to believe. We're going to present ideas. Doxa, not dogma. As you said, dogma is, there's only one universal brotherhood. So I think it's important to attract the young by technology and other means, but also to try to find out where they are and bring them up through a dialectic, and not say, you have to believe this, just consider this. Not to believe anything I say until you proved it to yourself. I think the Buddha said that. So what is the best way to get that across about the ULT? Thank you.
Well, thank you. That's a very good question. Jonathan, you want to go first?
Well, yeah, I won't speak too long, but a quick answer to that would be to do what you've done, Judy, a lot of your life, which is to hang out with young people. I just think so. And I've been blessed with a bunch of kids, you know, and I've just learned so much from them, you know, playing ping pong, you know, with them. It's just, it's all good. And then just enjoying and finding out where people are, you know, and asking more questions. And Judge is very good about that. And they're all really strong on that, about learning to listen and to find and kind of discern the trajectory of another person's thought, and not necessarily being attached to, oh, this person is going to become a theosophist. But the main thing is just to get out of the way of the questioning process, and to encourage that line of questioning. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And of course, there is no ultimate answer to it, but I've seen it in the past too, in some lodges, that when people come and they start inquiring, they get thrown the three fundamentals over them, you know, and we don't know anything about these people. That, well, it's no surprise that sometimes they quickly run off. So I think the first thing that we need to do is to inform ourselves with regard to where that person is, you know. What are their own interests? How do they look upon the world? And if we can go into a dialogue, which is, by the way, a word that I prefer over discussion, because in a discussion there seems to be an element of friction there. But if we can go into a dialogue with each other and learn where the other person is, and even to the extent that when you hear them talk and they make mistakes, we can just point out a few of the thinking mistakes they make without offending them, of course, but put some holes in what they think, because on the whole, people that inquire about something new, they already come with their own thoughts. When they go home after a dialogue or a discussion, they're usually still thinking about what they had to contribute. But if we can put some holes into certain aspects of their thinking, then that becomes connected with their way of thinking, and they take that home also. And then we stand a chance that they start to ask deeper questions. So, but there's no ultimate answer to that. How to, like you said, we have to get in touch with people, increase our efforts online. And I mean, you made a good point that, of course, some people like to come to lodges, but if you're living in New Mexico or in Nebraska,
Yep.
or in Montana, you're not going to come to Los Angeles or San Diego every week. Obviously not. So we really have to up the ante there with respect to online presentations, which can be done
Yep.
at the same time while we are in a building or even in a park. So any
Joe?
Joe, go ahead.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yep.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you, gentlemen, for your reflections. When I think about the history of ULT, another really important stripe to it was an effort to conserve original literature, that there was a lot of innovation going on for 10 or 15 years, a lot of people claiming successorship or claiming to, present new facts and all of that. So it was, in some ways, I think of it as a conservative reform movement. I wonder what you might think about that. And in conservative in the vast sense, that a true conservative is someone who guards against what we might call, bastard innovation, illegitimate innovation, seeking novelty for its own sake, or novelty can be an overgrowth that obscures something that's of fundamental value. So you want to keep your, sort of like constitutionalism, you want to keep your eye on what's really fundamental. So, I mean, in that way, it did an invaluable service in keeping, H.P. Blavatsky's writings, WQJ, et cetera. And I'd say in that way it succeeded. I don't think now those writings are in danger of being obscured. I think they're, very widely regarded now. But in view of the fact, that movements of conservatism or progressivism may be good or relevant according to time and the way things change, it seems to me maybe that stripe of ULT is not so relevant anymore. I don't know. I just wonder how you might respond to that.
Yeah.
Well, when we think of the different efforts that have been made through the centuries, Tsongkhapa made a decision to bring some more light to the West, even though he said it's probably not going to help very much because they can't listen, and which is still true today up to a certain point. The way I think of the effort that, because that relates also to your question with regard to 1975, for instance, is that HVB's effort was the sixth effort. And if we correspond that to the principles, then you could say that, well, for instance, it corresponded with Budi. She was the first one to throw wide open this information so that everybody had access to it. All the other efforts before usually happened through some kind of secret societies and stuff like that. And that was also necessary up to a point because the church came after everything that went against that, of course. So the question then is, what could be the seventh effort? Now, all the previous efforts were individual efforts, like setting up secret societies. HPV was the first one to throw it open universal. Well, what else can the seventh then be than the individual in the universal? So I often find material online or in books or by talking to people who, even though they have no clue about theosophy, they can bring something up, sometimes even one word, that throws kind of a specialist view in something that we have, that we're discussing in theosophy, but for which HPB has not provided much of a depth. Because, I mean, she can't do everything, of course. She has covered everything with a bunch of ideas, but once you start diving into it, we're a little bit on our own. And I think there's a lot of individuals now that in specialisms provide a lot of answers for the more universal approaches that HPB has brought, you know. And I don't know if that answers your question, Joe, but I think it relates to it at least. Jonathan?
I appreciate the question and I appreciate the answer. And just in view of time, is it okay to move on to Monica?
Thank you. This is such a wonderful presentation, and it certainly it's putting me in a thoughtful mode. I'm wondering, first of all, there was one item, Jonathan, the corporate media is true. Could you help me out with that, please? I'm not sure I'm understanding your point there.
Maybe I was being kind of exaggerated. How do I deal with that? Maybe it's just this big thing that I'm going through, that I'm just have so much more energy that I don't watch the news anymore. I keep track of things, and to be totally isolated from news, I think it's just selfish, because we don't live in a vacuum, and we do live in a world, there's these incredible forces going on. But it seems that there's a lot of cynicism, there's a lot of character assassination beyond the necessary. There's a lot of polarization, beyond the necessary. And there doesn't seem to be a just news for profit. That's what I mean by corporate, news. And it's based on selling these commercials. So you have on the, what are they selling? They're selling cars, ED meds, just all kind. So the thing is the news gets you all amped up vibrationally and all out of kilter vibrationally. So you get dialed into all their, there's that Crosby article, The Power of Suggestion, where he says that's a big problem. It's kind of like the biggest problem almost, going into this century, and it's still true now as it was in his time. Can you imagine if he would have wrote that article now, if you, stuff like that. And also this is, and one more thing is that it really could be that we are on the cusp of something really, really golden in the age of Kali Yuga. It really could be that there is, in all of this pain and in all of this destruction of institutions and norms and conventional moralities and just destruction all around us, that the whole thing is, the whole house of cards is just imploding, and that there may be some radical changes where this whole country may not even be a country anymore. Okay. Where our whole calendar may not be the same. Just rethink everything. And it might be a good thing, because there might be a little more opportunity actually for theosophy to enter the arena. not all at once in a big splash, but in all the interstices. And to me, we're basically the people are coming either from the point of view of materialism and that the world's coming to an end, or from the point of view of some kind of a morality based on churches and so forth, and that everything's going down the toilet. But whether everything's coming to an end or going down the toilet, it's really the same thing. But there's this third rail, there's this third possibility of something really magical that may being able to give birth to. And believe it or not, the principles of the ULT are kind of like this Akashic skeleton around which a lot of these things may fall into place. Perhaps. So is that
Well, thank you. That's a big help. It really ties into something that just came to the surface for me listening to the two of you, and that is the idea that I feel that young people feel exasperated and failed by all that has been put before them as a solution, whether it be religion or the bombardment they're experiencing through corporate greed of this materialism that, if you buy this or buy that, you'll be happy. And I think between the two of those things, there is a despair about not having a good stronghold in self-dependency. And so this seems to be a pillar of theosophy, that we're responsible for ourselves. And I know dear Maluka put in the chat this idea that she was asking, why is it that young people are attracted to Buddhism? And the answer that came up in this student's mind is the idea of self-responsibility is very loud in Buddhism. And it's not necessarily explained or made clear in the sense that a young person immediately understands there's also devotion, there's also a higher aspect to answer to. But there's definitely the idea that it's on me, that I, that I can take strength in this idea at least. And so I'm thinking that this can be a connection for young people where theosophy is concerned, how it's put together and presented to young people. I do not know. But I know that the idea that they feel that they have been failed, and there is a strength that can be gained about the idea of, well, all I've got is me, but they don't know that how majestic and grand their me is. So if there's some way to do an outreach in a way that they are helped to understand their divinity is what gives them this responsibility, maybe they can make the connection with theosophy.
Well, you have given us a dose of therapy, Aquarian therapy, if you will. Bravo, just everything. Pierre, did you have anything on that follow through? You might be muted. Yeah, you're muted, Pierre.
No, I don't have anything to add to that. I think Monica gave a good answer to that.
Thank you. Michelle?
Oh, yes. Thank you, Monica. Very interesting insights. I think you're onto something there. I just wanted to make a comment to Judy's question. As a young person, I was brought to Theosophy by a person, and one of the marked things that he did was that he taught me that he didn't teach me about liberation. He taught me that a deep sacrifice was possible. And he pointed towards teachers. And not only that, but it was his living example that really brought me to Theosophy, because I could see that he had actually gone through some of these things, and it was a living power in his life. And he really connected with the heart. And then he engaged my mind. And then we discussed and spoke about the teachings. But I think that if that heart connection isn't there, and if there aren't individuals that can be looked up to as a living example, kind of like a student-teacher relationship in some way, then I think Theosophy will just become another philosophy. And I know that it's different for many different people, but that's really what brought me to Theosophy and why I chose to stay in it and to keep with it.
Oh, thank you, Michelle. Pierre?
Yeah, I think it's a very good point. Maybe also what attracts to people to Buddhism is probably because the religious element in it, and I don't mean that in a Western sense, but the religious element in it and the ability to see what they perceive as examples, like through their gurus and their, geshes and so forth, that they perhaps see more of an example in what is possible rather than in Theosophy, where we see as, all more or less on the same level, So that can be a stumbling block there for students coming to Theosophy. And nevertheless, we have to maintain some of these principles in that sense, and that goes back to an aspect of Joe's question. The student of Theosophy is conservative in terms that we try to preserve the principles, but we also have to be willing to revisit our principles. Whereas we are, on the other hand, very progressive, so to speak, in terms of the applications of those principles. And the possibilities are just legion there. So we're always walking the razor's edge there. And that's very difficult for people to join into. A lot of people sometimes shirk a certain kind of responsibility. They would like others to do something for them so that they can make progress, Whereas in Theosophy, usually everything is focused on self-devised and self-induced efforts. And that can be a big hurdle for a lot of people.
Yeah, it could be that it occurred that there's 3 different levels of approach in Theosophy, and for different people, it's probably in a different order. Well, there's probably 70 or 90 orders, but I thought of 3. Anyway, one is the rational explanation of things. It's soul satisfying in that way, right? That kind of hits somebody with that, right? Another would be the responsibility part of it, that I really am on myself here. I got to do this under my own volition here. And a person feels like they're being treated like an adult when they're told that, and that's satisfying. It's like, I thought I was an adult. And the third one may be this realization that Michelle is talking about the sacrifice. And that's very meaningful, and that it starts to appeal to people at a deeper level, that wow, all this life has a purpose, and that the most noblest people alive, they're the ones that figure out that purpose, that it's really all about sacrifice. There's something very deep about that, deeply devotional about that. And then maybe even at another level, it's this idea of the bodhisattva ideal. And maybe that's the big thing on Buddhism, perhaps. It's not only responsibility, but the bodhisattva ideal. That just grabs the heart like unbelievable. And so maybe that's where we should be going first. And then from there, start to do the intellectual part. And somewhere the self-delusion part will fit into the picture. So maybe it's kind of a rethinking. Maybe the age is moving along and we need to rethink things. It's just it's a question. Anthony?
HPB was so enthusiastic, and that just shows through all of her writings. And she had great faith that if the 20th century, going into the 20th century, if humanity would just adopt these theosophic principles, it would transform the world, to the point where she says at the end, of the key, tell me, I say, if I go too far in asserting the earth will be a heaven in the 21st century in comparison with what it is now. So yes, she was very, very enthusiastic. Now I guess we have the luxury, sitting in the 21st century to debate whether she was too sanguine in that belief, but the point is she was very, very enthusiastic. At some point in the key, she does say she may have been a little too zealous in telling the world the identity of these masters, because they denigrated them. But that's another issue.
Here?
Yeah, with regard to HPV's bringing forward that idea of the masters, that was a little bit a do if you don't, a damned if you don't, damned if you do position there. But I think there's a very important element to it, because very often when people inquire about the big questions in life, who am I, where do I come from, is there a purpose to life? I think very often a question that is missed there, that is that before you ask all those questions, because they don't make much sense, if there is only one life and it's over and done, what is even the point in asking those questions? Because, after 70 to 100 years, you're a goner. I think a more important question, and that may be the reason why HPB has put forward that idea of the masters, is the question is man perfectible? Are we perfectible? Because if you can't answer that question, then there is also no need for the masters. And the masters are an example that perfectibility is possible, that we can reach beyond the limitations of our own personal existence. And I think that was a very important point that she brought forward there. I mean, we see examples that HPB says there are the adepts are those who have developed their physical, psychological, mental, and spiritual abilities to the utmost. And even there are degrees, don't be mistaken. There is nothing in manifestation that has no degrees, of course. But we see that there are people who succeed in elevating any one of those examples to a very great height. Think of people who are very great athletes, what they can do with their body. There are other people that are intellectually brilliant, other people that are ethically brilliant. We see some examples that go more in a spiritual direction, like say a Dalai Lama, for instance. Now, it's also possible, and we know of people that existed throughout history who combined or represented a combination of all those ideas. So it is indeed possible that we can perfect ourselves to a height that at present is just unimaginable. And I think that was the reason why she put it forward, notwithstanding that she sometimes regretted that she did so. But otherwise, well, where does the stuff come from? Where does Theosophy come from? Otherwise, she invented it, right? So that's a little bit of an enigma that we're encountering there. So that's my 2 cents on the subject there.
Thanks, Pierre. I guess we've kind of been past our time for quite a while, but I guess we'll take one more question from Diane Martin, who's, due to technicalities, has a different name. But Diane, why don't you go ahead and raise your question? You might, yeah, you're still on mute, so.
Right. Yeah, I want to go back to the importance of the heart doctrine. And I recall HPB said that the future involves our raising the Buddhi Manas of the race. And to me, that includes very much not forgetting the heart doctrine. And Michelle brought it up with the idea of the sacrifice. And so I immediately thought of the Bhagavad Gita, because that's the book of devotion. And devotion is sacrifice in action, it seems, all the chapters. And I think people are drawn to that book because they instinctively know that that is the heart doctrine, and that would involve the total man and the future.
Excellent. Well, beautifully said. Yeah, the Krishna, just everything he says is a call to action. And isn't that interesting that they say that it's a study of adepts, but according to what you're saying, you think that it's a study of perhaps of newcomers too. It's a study of everybody, just because everybody can kind of respond to the flute of Krishna, so to speak, and that tonality of devotion. It's like when Judge named 17 out of the 18 chapters, devotion according to this and devotion for that. Maybe we better pay attention to the word devotion. Like, which part of that do we not understand? So it's, it does seem to be, I mean, if you, one of the things that I've enjoyed about this online experience is just coming in contact with so many different theosophists that I didn't really know. And just years and years of study that they put in, and sacrifice and enthusiasm and heart quality, really, and intellectual development for sure. But the common thread, the Sutatma thread in this case, is that devotion element. And it's just been such a joy. So Pierre, do you have anything, closing comments?
Yeah, I think another important element is where HPV said at some point that she can't do anything with goody-goody people. You know, she wants people who take action, but also have a good understanding of the principles that hide behind those actions. And from many things that she said, you can really draw the conclusion that ethics is applied metaphysics, you know, and that takes things from both sides. There is, on the one hand, the development of the heart aspect of our being, but it's not enough to be good, because we've seen that in several world wars too, that good people can be, if they do not understand why they ultimately have to be and remain good, can sometimes be put on the wrong footing and run into the wrong direction. So we need to know why we need to develop that heart quality, why ethics is a necessity. And that is counteracted by, or kept in balance by, a higher intellectual understanding of what is the true source of goodness. And that obviously lies on a very high metaphysical level. And sometimes people say, oh my God, metaphysics, but don't forget that 99% of our existence is actually metaphysical. Because if I move my arm, I have actually I want to do that, but I have actually no clue about the ultimate source of why that is possible. And you can give another 1,000 examples in that direction. So metaphysics and the heart quality go hand in hand. And on our level, we could say, because sometimes people are a little bit put off by theosophy because there seems to be apparently little opening for practice, but our study itself is the practice. That's something that we need to realize.
Does anyone know the story of when young people asked HPV, what are the 3 most important things? Pierre, could you tell us the story?
Well, I don't know if it's really true, but I mean, most of you have heard it before. It's a good joke that HPV always had a lot of visitors, and very often while the visitors were sitting in the salon among each other, she was working on her desk and she didn't like to be disturbed. And at some point, a bunch of ladies asked the guy to go up to HPV and ask her, what is the most important point in the study of theosophy? And so he took all his courage together, knocked on her door, and indeed the door opened, and he asked the question, what is the most important thing in the study of theosophy? And she said, common sense. And obviously that didn't satisfy the guy too much, but he went back to the ladies and said, well, that's what she said. And they said, yeah, but we want something deeper. So he went back and she opened the door again. And then he said, so what's the second most important thing then? And she said, humor, And so he wasn't satisfied with that either. And eventually after a third time, he knocked on the door again and he asked, what is the third most important point? And she said, well, more common sense, So, and I think there's a great deal to say for that. Common sense doesn't seem to be too common anymore in our days, and a great deal of humor in the applications and study of theosophy. Sometimes we take things a little bit too serious, and sometimes we don't take them seriously enough. And it's finding the right balance in that.
Thank you so much for that. That's the best telling I've ever heard. All right. So, okay, well, gosh, thank you all for coming. We're going to learn about Tsongkhapa next week, and very much looking forward to that. And as you can see, there's a brilliant Sutratma thread running through all these, with all the health ones and so forth. And now we have the ULT, and then moving ahead to Tsongkhapa. So thank you all very much for your attendance and your questions, and thank you, Pierre, so much for your help.